A duffel bag sits hidden in an upscale Farmington Hills apartment. Inside, condoms, lingerie, credit card receipts, and envelopes addressed to the LA Escort Service with the name Crystal written in the corner. 23-year-old Tina Bigger's boyfriend, Todd, stares at these items in complete shock. The woman he lived with, the psychology major studying prostitution as an academic research project, had become one of the very people she was supposed to be studying. When Tina vanished in August 1995, Todd thought he knew everything about her. He was wrong. And what he would discover about her double life would lead investigators down a path toward a calculating con man who thought he'd gotten away with the perfect crime. This is that story. Tina Bigger looked like she had it all figured out. Born in 1972, she grew up as the daughter of a Coast Guard commander named Bill Bigger, who was stationed at Traverse City in northern Michigan. Coming from a military family meant structure, discipline, and high expectations. Tina met those expectations beautifully. By 1995, she was a senior at Oakland University near Detroit, majoring in psychology. She wasn't just a good student. She was driven, ambitious, someone who attacked every project with intensity. Her friends described her as bright and magnetic. Her professors knew her as someone who went above and beyond on every assignment. She had close friendships, particularly with a woman named Amy Vermeersch. She worked as a waitress at the Rochester Chop House, an upscale restaurant where she made good money serving expensive steaks and clam chowder to well-off clientele. She'd recently moved into an apartment with her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Todd Nernberger. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But here's the thing about people who look perfect from the outside. They're often hiding something beneath that polished surface. In fall 1995, Tina was working on what she believed would be her ticket to graduate school. The project was funded by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which should tell you how legitimate and important this research was supposed to be. She was part of a team of 8 Oakland University students studying AIDS awareness among female sex workers. The research had a specific structure. The OU students would interview women in jail about their knowledge of HIV and AIDS. Then, Wayne State University students would provide educational programs to these women. Finally, the OU students would follow up to measure what the women had learned and retained. The entire time, personnel from the Dickerson Detention Center in Hamtramck supervised the students to ensure their safety. Tina's specific angle was comparing AIDS awareness between street prostitutes and high-end escorts. She wanted to understand if there was a difference in health consciousness between women working the streets and those working for upscale escort services. It was a legitimate academic question, one that could provide valuable public health insights. Tina put her all into this study, Amy would later recall. But somewhere along the way, observation turned into participation. Think about that for a second. Tina went from researching these women's lives to living one herself. For an entire year before her disappearance, Tina had been working as a high-priced call girl, not just with one service, with 3 different escort agencies. She charged up to $250 per appointment, which in 1995 was significant money. She went by the name Crystal and became one of the most requested escorts at the LA Escort Service. Why would someone like Tina, smart, educated, from a stable family with a decent job and a boyfriend, risk everything to become an escort? Some insight surfaced during the investigation. Oakland University wasn't cheap. Even as a public school, tuition ran high. Today it costs around $27,000 per year. Tina had maxed out her credit cards. She needed money for school, for living expenses, for the lifestyle she wanted to maintain. The escort work brought in cash, and lots of it. But author Fanny Weinstein, who wrote The Co-ed Call Girl Murder about this case, suggested there might have been more to it than just money. Tina also had another side to her. She could be distrustful, she could be vengeful, she had a temper at times too. This was a Tina that not a lot of people who knew her saw. Maybe it was about control, maybe it was about power, maybe it was about living a secret life that made her feel alive in ways her regular existence didn't. We'll never know for sure because Tina never got the chance to explain it herself. What we do know is that she kept this secret incredibly well. Every day, she'd put on her waitress uniform, clothes for a job she'd actually quit 4 months earlier. She'd leave the apartment, kiss Todd goodbye, and head out. But she wasn't going to the Rochester Chop House anymore. She was going to appointments with clients, men who paid her for companionship and sexual services. The deception was elaborate, calculated, and completely convincing. Until the day she vanished. August 23rd, 1995. Started like any other day. Tina left the apartment. Todd went about his business, expecting her home later. But evening came and she wasn't there. That was unusual, but not completely unprecedented. They'd had an on and off relationship with its share of rocky moments. But then she missed a planned date with Todd. Since we'd lived together, that never happened, he'd later testify. When she didn't come home the next day either, real panic set in. Todd called her family in Traverse City. Something was terribly wrong. On August 24th, Todd and Bill Bigger filed a missing person report with Farmington Hills Police. Todd called the Rochester Chop House, thinking maybe she'd picked up an extra shift. Maybe there was some simple explanation. What the manager told him was the first shock that would completely upend everything he thought he knew about Tina. She'd quit her job 4 months ago. Think about that. For 4 months, Tina had been washing her waitress uniforms, getting dressed for work, leaving at the right times, coming home at reasonable hours, all while living a completely different life that Todd knew nothing about. In desperate confusion, Todd began searching their apartment for any clue about where Tina might have gone. That's when he found the duffel bag, the one filled with the tools of a secret trade he never knew she practiced. Condoms, thigh-high stockings, lingerie, sexual lubricant, credit card receipts, and those envelopes with "Crystal" written in the corner. Todd didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was overwhelming. He contacted police and turned over everything he'd found. Investigators began calling the escort services whose business cards and receipts were in Tina's belongings. When they called the LA Escort Service, the owners initially denied knowing anyone named Tina Bigger. But when asked about someone named Crystal, their demeanor changed immediately. Crystal was one of their most popular escorts. Beautiful, intelligent, articulate. Clients loved her. She'd been working for them for months, building up quite a client list that now became a suspect list. Police were now looking for a missing woman who'd been living a dangerous double life. Her sister Julie told reporters, "I think that she is gone or that she is kidnapped. I keep thinking, Silence of the Lambs." That reference to the serial murderer film shows just how terrified her family was. Investigators had to comb through dozens of clients across 3 different escort services. Any one of them could be responsible for Tina's disappearance. But one name kept appearing more frequently than others in the records. Ken Tranchida. Ken was a 42-year-old man who'd requested Tina's services multiple times. Their first encounter had been just 12 days before her disappearance at a seedy motel called the Bluebird Motel. But the relationship had clearly progressed beyond simple business transactions. Among Tina's belongings, investigators found a love letter from Ken. It was filled with romantic promises and declarations of devotion. complete with poetry. The kind of letter that suggested Ken believed this was more than a client-escort relationship. Ken was also seen with Tina at car dealerships, where witnesses reported he'd offered to loan her money for a vehicle. When police brought Ken in for questioning, what they found was disturbing, but not in the way they expected. Ken Tranchida was not a wealthy businessman. He was not a person of means who could afford to loan anyone money for a car. He was a career criminal, a drifter, a con man with an extensive record that included bad checks, forgery, fraud, embezzlement, breaking and entering, and theft. Born in Detroit in 1953 and raised in Southfield, Ken had bounced from one menial job to another, stealing from most of his employers along the way. After working the front desk at an easy rest hotel, he'd helped himself to the cash and fled, leaving behind new jewelry and baby items in his room. This pathetic little man with a squeaky voice had spun elaborate lies about his wealth and status. He'd told Tina he had money, connections, a comfortable life. He'd portrayed himself as someone who could rescue her from her dangerous double life. And Tina, desperate for a way out, had fallen for every word. Ken admitted to police that he'd met Tina through the escort service. According to his account, he'd driven her to the airport just 1 week before her disappearance for a flight to Ohio to meet another client. She'd left her car with him for safekeeping while she traveled. But flight records showed no Tina Bigger on any Ohio-bound aircraft. That story was another lie. Ken had been driving Tina's Honda Accord since her disappearance. Initially, when police examined the vehicle, they found nothing particularly suspicious. Just names and addresses of more escort clients, along with directions to their homes. With no concrete evidence linking Ken to any crime, police were forced to release him. It was a decision they would deeply regret. Bill Bigger wasn't about to let his daughter's disappearance go unsolved. He assembled an unusual team of amateur investigators, the escort service owners, Donna and Debbie, a tow truck driver named Jerry Holbert, who was friends with Ken but sympathetic to the Biggers, and Todd. This team stayed close to Ken, shadowing him, trying to get him to slip up and reveal something useful. When Ken landed in jail for skipping meetings with his parole officer, Bill and his team paid $250 to bail him out, keeping him close. They followed him to the Pink Flamingo trailer park where he was staying. Bill even took Ken out to dinner at a local Ram's Horn restaurant, where Ken spun various stories about Tina's whereabouts. She was at a Hilton in Dayton. His friend knew where she was, but he'd lost the number and would page him later. Meanwhile, police decided to take another look at Tina's car. What they'd initially dismissed as coffee stains now appeared distinctly different under closer examination. When they peeled back the trunk carpet, their worst fears were confirmed. A significant pool of blood stained the right side of the trunk, blood that had soaked through the carpet liner and pooled underneath. Think about how embarrassing this was. The blood was visible enough that you could see dark staining on a coffee mug or other items in the trunk. How did trained investigators miss this the first time? The oversight was humiliating and potentially deadly. Ken had walked free with critical evidence hidden in plain sight. DNA testing revealed the blood belonged to Tina Bigger. The amount indicated she'd suffered severe trauma, possibly a fatal injury, in that trunk. But by the time this discovery was made, Ken Tranchida had vanished. Nearly a month after Tina's disappearance, on September 21st, 1995, police got the break they needed from an unexpected source, Ken's own brother. He suggested investigators search a deserted house once owned by Ken's aunt, located about 10 miles from Tina's apartment on 9 Mile Road near Lasser in Southfield. In the woods behind the abandoned home, Southfield police found what they'd been dreading: the badly decomposed remains of a young woman. The lack of blood pools around the body confirmed what the trunk evidence had already suggested. This wasn't where she'd been ended. She'd been transported here after her demise, dumped in this remote location where Ken thought she might never be found. Dental records confirmed everyone's worst fears. They'd found Tina Bigger. The pattern of decomposition, which had begun in the neck area, suggested strangulation or some other form of trauma to the neck. The medical examiner determined she'd died from blows to the head and neck. But the advanced decomposition made it impossible to determine the exact method. What was certain was that this was an unnatural demise. About 100 students attended a vigil for Tina at Oakland University on the following Monday. They raised $500 for the Bigger family. Tina was buried in Elkton, South Dakota, in a light blue and silver casket, in a plot next to her brother who had gone as an infant, and Ken Tranchita was still missing. The manhunt for Ken Tranchita ended when investigators tracked him down to a rundown Detroit neighborhood. When they closed in, Ken made a theatrical attempt at ending his own life, attempting to slit his wrists and drinking chemicals. But it was all for show. He surrendered without any real harm done to himself. Under interrogation, Ken's story kept changing, which was typical for someone who'd spent his entire life lying. His first version went like this. He and Tina had spent August 23rd together, eating at restaurants and shopping for a car. They returned to the room he was renting in Southfield and drank a bottle of whiskey and a few beers. They got into an argument because he wanted her to stop being an escort. But she liked the money. The argument escalated. She fell and hit her head on a safe in the bedroom. He thought she was playing around at first, but when he shook her, she didn't wake up. He panicked, put her body in the trunk of her car, and drove it to his aunt's abandoned house where he dumped her body behind the property. But X-rays of Tina's skull revealed no fractures that would support his story of her falling and hitting her head. When confronted with this medical evidence, Ken revised his story. And what he said next was chilling. According to his new confession, Tina had discovered that Ken had lied about having money to loan her for a car. When she realized the jig was up, that he wasn't the wealthy businessman he'd pretended to be, but just a gas station attendant with an extensive criminal record, she tried to leave his room. He couldn't let her go. "I smothered her with my hand," Ken would later say during a parole hearing. "I put my hand over her face. She couldn't breathe." But there was more to it than that. Prosecutors believe Ken beat and strangled Tina on his bed. He then hid the bloody mattress in the attic, telling his landlady he'd gotten rid of it because he'd thrown up on it. He placed Tina in the trunk of her car, which explains the massive amount of blood found there. He drove to his aunt's house and dumped her body in the woods. And then Ken came up with the most audacious justification for what he'd done. He told police that Tina had been so miserable about her financial problems and the life she was living that he decided to put her out of her misery. He was doing her a favor, he claimed. It was practically mercy. This from the man who'd lied about having money, who'd strung her along with false promises, who'd contributed to the very desperation he later used to justify ending her life. On October 13, 1995, Ken Tranchita appeared at his arraignment. He immediately declared, "I'm guilty." But Judge Stephen Cooper urged him to speak to a lawyer before entering any formal plea. Ken was charged with first-degree ending of life and faced potential life in prison without parole if convicted. The Bigger family was devastated, but they were also concerned about something else: publicity. Bill Bigger told reporters, "Put your name in the headlines. Put your daughter's and son's names in the headlines. The sustaining hurt is right here." He felt that journalists profited from others' pain, and he wanted to protect what remained of his daughter's privacy. To avoid a trial that would expose every detail of Tina's double life to public scrutiny, the family agreed to a plea deal. In May 1996, Ken Tranchida pleaded guilty to second-degree ending of life and habitual offender charges. Judge Rudy Nichols handed down 2 life sentences, one for the ending of life itself and another for being a habitual offender due to his extensive criminal history. The sentences meant Ken would serve at minimum 25 years before becoming eligible for parole. The family felt the court handled the case well, but had no warm words for the media, one account noted. Here's something that might shock you. Ken Tranchida is still alive and still in prison, but he's been trying to get out. In 2011 and 2016, Ken became eligible for parole reviews, but the Michigan Parole Board showed no interest in releasing him. Then, in May 2021, after 25 years behind bars, he finally got his first public parole hearing. Ken, now 67 years old with near shoulder-length gray hair and large-framed eyeglasses, appeared via video from Muskegon Correctional Facility for the hearing. The proceedings were held remotely due to the COVID-19 pandemic, with Michigan Parole Board member Jerome Warfield and Assistant Attorney General Alicia Lane conducting the questioning. And Ken's performance during that hearing? It was a masterclass in why career criminals shouldn't be released. He gave multiple conflicting versions of how Tina passed. First, he said they'd been drinking and using substances, got into an argument, and she fell and hit her head on a safe. Then, when pressed about the lack of head trauma evidence, he admitted to smothering her. Then he claimed he strangled her. Then he denied strangling her. Warfield directly challenged him. "I'm not buying your answers about how she was eliminated." Ken tried to present himself as a changed man. "I'm not the same person I was 25 years ago," he said. He claimed he'd taken classes in anger management, substance abuse, and Bible studies. He apologized to the Bigger family, saying, "I'm sorry I ruined your life. I ruined your daughter's life. I wish I could go back, give up her life and let her live." But then Ken said something that probably sealed his fate. He told the parole board that if released, he'd need a monitor placed on him to keep him away from temptations. "This way, it will help me stay away from everything that is not good for me." Think about that. A man asking for parole while simultaneously admitting he can't trust himself to stay out of trouble without electronic surveillance. As one retired attorney commented on coverage of the hearing, the defendant's request for a monitor sunk any chance for parole. As of November 2024, Ken Tranchida remains incarcerated at a Michigan correctional facility, now approximately 70 years old. Given that the parole board's skepticism during his 2021 hearing and the fact that he's eligible for review every 5 years, his next potential parole hearing would be in 2026. Based on the lack of any news reports about his release, it's highly likely he's still behind bars, serving out his life sentence for the ending of Tina Bigger's life. So what really happened that day in August 1995? Here's what the evidence and Ken's various confessions tell us. Tina called Ken on August 23rd. They spent the day together. Breakfast at Big Boy, hanging out at the mall, visiting car dealerships where Ken pretended he had money to help her buy a vehicle. After dinner, they went back to the rented room where Ken was staying in Southfield. At some point, Tina confronted him about the money. She'd been expecting him to help her with the car loan, but he kept stalling. Maybe she pressed him for details. Maybe she started asking questions he couldn't answer. The truth came out. He wasn't a wealthy businessman. He was a broke ex-con working minimum wage jobs, someone who'd lied about everything. "I was mad 'cause I got discovered. I was not who I said I was," Ken admitted during his parole hearing. "I out and out, straight up lied." The jig was up. Tina tried to leave. She was done with him, done with his lies. probably realizing she'd been played by someone even more desperate than herself. But Ken couldn't let her leave. Maybe it was rage at being exposed. Maybe it was panic about what she might tell others. Maybe it was the narcissistic injury of being rejected and seen for what he truly was. Whatever his motivation, Ken attacked her. The amount of blood in the trunk, combined with the autopsy findings of injuries to her head and neck, suggests he beat her brutally. Some investigators believe he may have cut her throat, which would explain the massive blood loss. He also strangled or smothered her, covering her face with his hand until she stopped breathing. He placed her body in the trunk of her own car, where her blood pooled and soaked through the carpet. He drove to his aunt's abandoned house and carried her body into the woods, dumping her behind the property where he thought she might never be found. Then Ken went back to his room, hid the bloody mattress in the attic, and came up with his cover story. He drove Tina's car around for a week, telling people she'd left it with him while traveling to Ohio. When the car was examined by police, they missed the blood the first time, and Ken walked free. He might have gotten away with it entirely, if not for his own brother, who provided the tip about the abandoned house. He might have gotten away with it if police hadn't taken that second look at Tina's car. He might have gotten away with it if he'd been just a little bit smarter, a little less obvious. But Ken Tranchida wasn't smart. He was a career criminal who'd spent his entire life taking shortcuts, stealing what he wanted, lying to get what he needed. And when Tina discovered the truth about him, he took the ultimate shortcut, eliminating the person who threatened to expose him. Tina Biggar should be 52 years old right now. She could have finished her degree, gone to graduate school, become a psychologist. She could have helped people, made a difference, built a life beyond the double existence she was trapped in during those final months. Instead, her story became a cautionary tale, one that's been the subject of books like The Co-ed Call Girl Ending by Fanny Weinstein, episodes of Forensic Files, and countless true crime discussions. The case raises uncomfortable questions. Why did a smart, educated woman from a stable family decide to become an escort? Was it purely financial, or was there something else driving her choices? What was she really researching? The lives of sex workers or herself? Did crossing that line from observer to participant represent some kind of psychological break? Or was it a calculated decision that she believed she could control? We'll never know the answers because Tina never got the chance to explain herself. To grow beyond those choices, to figure out who she really was and wanted to be. What we do know is that her research project became her downfall. The world she was studying proved far more dangerous than she anticipated. The glamorous image of high-end escort work that she might have imagined bore no resemblance to the reality. A reality that included desperate men like Ken Tranchida, con artists who preyed on vulnerable women, people who saw escorts as less than human, disposable objects who could be eliminated when they became inconvenient. Bill Biggar and his family tried desperately to find his daughter, even after she vanished. They assembled that amateur investigative team. They stayed close to Ken. They never gave up. But in the end, all their efforts couldn't bring Tina back. They could only ensure that her ending was investigated, that Ken faced justice, and that Tina wasn't forgotten. At Oakland University, Tina is remembered not for her double life, but for her dedication to her studies and her passion for understanding human behavior. Tina put her all into this study, her friend Amy said. That commitment, that intensity, that need to fully immerse herself in whatever she was doing, those qualities defined Tina Biggar. She just immersed herself too deeply, trusted the wrong person, and paid the ultimate price. Ken Tranchida sits in prison today, an old man who spent more time behind bars than Tina got to spend alive. He claims he's changed, that he's remorseful, that he deserves another chance. but his shifting stories, his inability to tell the truth even when it might help him, and his request for monitoring if released all suggest that some people never really change. And that's the story of how a psychology student's research project became her ending sentence, and how a con man thought he could eliminate his way out of being exposed, only to spend the rest of his life behind bars, exactly where he belongs.